What Zephaniah 2 foretold about the end of Gaza. The night the fires reached Ashkelon, the sea threw the sound of the sacking back. By dawn, the harbor town that had traded with the world for 6 centuries was ash, and its king was walking north in a Babylonian chain. In 604 BC, you would call it breaking news. A prophet named Zephaniah had already written that ending, city by city, more than 20 years before the first Babylonian spear touched that coast. He named Gaza, he named Ashdod, he named Ekron, then he named what would take their place, shepherds and their flocks. Turn to Zephaniah 2, and you meet one of the most exact addresses in all of Scripture. For Gaza shall be forsaken, the oracle reads, and Ashkelon a desolation. 4 cities of the Philistine coast, each handed a separate sentence, each set down roughly 2,600 years ago by a man watching the world from a small hill in Judah. I have spent years with prophetic texts, and most of them work in symbols, beasts, numbers, visions that need a locksmith. This one does not. This one reads like a war map with the towns already circled. That is what makes Zephaniah 2 so strange and so worth slowing down over. Most people, when they hear the word Gaza, think only of the present. That is understandable. But the name is old, older than almost anything in the news cycle. And long before it was a modern headline, it was one of 5 cities that ran along a thin ribbon of coast. Zephaniah did not name one. He named the row of them: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza. The oracle marched down the shoreline the way an invading army would, and it did that on purpose. When a prophet lists the towns in the order the road runs, he is telling you he can already see the road being walked. I want to be careful here, and I will be careful all the way through. This is not a video about taking a side in a modern war. It is not a coded message about any people alive today. It is an old text about an ancient people called the Philistines, and about the God the Hebrew prophets believed held every coastline and every empire in his hand. Read it any other way, and you have left the page. So here is what I want to do with you. By the end of this video, I want you to understand who these Philistines actually were, where they came from, and why nearly every prophet in the Hebrew Bible turned to face their coast at some point and spoke judgment over it. I want to walk the exact fulfillment, the empires that came down that shoreline, one after another. And I want to show you the strangest line of all, the one where the same coast that was sentenced to ruin is promised in the same breath to the remnant of Judah, ruin and return, written together. Stay with me, because the ancient Philistines are the key that unlocks the whole passage, and the passage is far more careful than the headlines that keep dragging its oldest word back into the light. Let me start with the question you are probably already asking. Why is a 2,600-year-old oracle suddenly relevant again? The honest answer is simple. A single word from the ancient Philistine coast keeps surfacing in the news. And when people notice that word sitting inside an old prophetic book, something in them stops cold. They want to know what the text meant and whether the old page somehow saw the present coming. I understand the pull. I have felt it myself, more than once, sitting with the passage late at night while the headlines scrolled on another screen. But I have lived with this oracle long enough to tell you where that pull goes wrong. Reading Zephaniah as a coded message about anyone alive on that land today is the fastest way to misread it. This is not a comment on modern people. It is an oracle against an ancient nation that has not existed for more than 2,000 years. So we are going to do the patient thing, the thing that actually honors a text like this. We are going to return to the text, set the newspaper down, and stay on the page with the ancient Philistine coast until we understand what the prophet himself was saying. Everything good in this study depends on that discipline, and returning to the text means beginning with the man who wrote it. The book opens with a genealogy in Zephaniah 1, verse 1, which tells us he prophesied in the days of Josiah the son of Ammon, king of Judah. That one line pins him to a moment in time. Josiah reigned in the late 7th century BC, roughly 640 to 609, the king who found the lost book of the law in the temple and tore his robes over it. Zephaniah traces his own ancestry back 4 generations, which is unusual for a prophet, and has led many to suspect he was of royal blood, perhaps a descendant of King Hezekiah himself. What matters most for us is the timing, and I keep coming back to it. Zephaniah spoke to a small kingdom, caught between 2 giants, the dying empire of Assyria in the north and the rising power of Babylon just behind it. The whole ancient Near East was about to be reshuffled, and a watchful person in Judah could feel it. In the days of Josiah, the old order was cracking. I believe that trembling world is written into every line of the coastal oracle. The prophet was not musing about a distant future. He was reading the storm clouds already gathering on his own horizon in the 7th century BC. From there, the book widens out, and this is the part most readers skip. Zephaniah 2 is not only about the Philistine shore. It is a sweep across the whole compass, a survey of the nations that ringed Judah on every side. To the east, he turns toward Moab and Ammon, the old rivals across the Jordan River who had troubled Israel since the days of the wilderness. He accuses them of pride and of mocking the people of God, and he promises their proud cities will become like Sodom, a place of nettles and salt pits. Then he keeps turning. To the south, he names Cush, the great African power beyond Egypt, warning that its people too will fall by the sword. And to the far north, he fixes his eyes on Assyria and Nineveh, the empire whose very name meant terror, promising that its glittering capital will be left as dry and empty as a desert, a place where flocks lie down and wild birds nest in the ruined pillars. Do you see the pattern? Every direction, every border, every throne is named. The structure itself is the message. The prophet is declaring that no nation, however great, stands outside the reach of the God he serves, which brings the whole compass back to one stretch of shoreline. And here is what I find striking. Of all the nations in the chapter, it is the Philistine seacoast that gets the sharpest, most detailed language, and it comes first, before Moab, before Cush, before mighty Assyria. The prophet leads with the coast. He calls its people the nation of the Cherethites, an old term that hints at their origins across the sea, and he addresses the whole region as Canaan, the land of the Philistines. Standing in Judah, he looks west toward the water and names the 5 old cities that had been Israel's thorn for centuries. Here is where I have landed, after living with this text. The coast comes first, not because it was the greatest power in the chapter, but because its story with God's people was the longest, the closest, and the most personal. Assyria was far away and terrible. The Philistine coast was near and familiar, the enemy just over the western hills, woven into Israel's memory from the days of the judges. Many readers rush past verse 5 to get to the famous cities, and they miss how loaded that opening address really is. To understand why that shoreline carried such weight, and why the prophets kept returning to it, we have to go back much further than Zephaniah, all the way to where these Philistines actually came from. To understand the Philistines, you have to picture a world coming apart. Around the 12th century BC, the great Bronze Age kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost all at once. The Hittite Empire fell. Mighty cities from Greece to Syria burned and were abandoned. Trade routes that had carried copper and tin and grain for centuries went silent, and famine followed. Historians still argue about the exact causes: drought, earthquakes, invasion, system failure, all of it at once. But everyone agrees on the result. The old world ended, and out of that chaos, across the sea, came waves of displaced peoples. The Egyptian scribes lumped these newcomers together under one dread name: the Sea Peoples. And this is not legend I am reciting to you. It is carved into stone that you can still visit. On the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, near ancient Thebes, there are enormous reliefs showing Pharaoh's forces meeting these invaders in a great battle on land and water. Among the groups named in the accompanying inscriptions are the Peliset. Read that word slowly, Peliset. It is, as far as most scholars can tell, the Egyptian rendering of the very people the Hebrew Bible calls the Philistines. The name that fills Zephaniah's oracle is written on an Egyptian temple wall from the 12th century BC.
I remember the first time I actually studied photograph of the Medinet Habu relief. Rather than just reading a paragraph about them in a book, the details stopped me. The invaders wear a distinctive headdress, a crown of what looks like a feather or reeds. And here's the part that changed how I saw them. They come with ox cart carrying women and children.
That single detail tells you almost everything. These were not raiders looking for plunder and a ride home. They were whole peoples on the move, migrants dragging their families and their belongings, looking for somewhere new to live because the old somewhere had burned. Ramses III claims to have stopped them at the borders of Egypt around 1177 BC, in the 8th year of his reign. And what happened next is the piece that matters most for our text. Blocked from settling in Egypt itself, these sea peoples turned and settled instead along the southern coast of Canaan, the very shoreline Zephaniah would address centuries later. The 5 cities we are going to walk through were, in effect, an Aegean settlement planted on the edge of the Near East. When you read the prophet naming Gaza and Ashkelon, you are reading about the descendants of refugees from a collapsed sea world who made that coast their home. The Bible itself remembers exactly where they came from, and it is worth hearing in its own words. In Amos 9 verse 7, God asks a question that must have startled its first hearers, because it puts Israel and Philistia side by side. Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor? Caphtor. The prophets reach for that name again in Jeremiah 47 verse 4, where the Lord speaks of destroying the remnant of the country of Caphtor. 2 different prophets, generations apart, both trace the Philistines back to the same distant origin point across the sea. And where was Caphtor? Most scholars identify it with Crete and the wider Aegean world, the islands and coastlands of the Greek Sea. Deuteronomy 2 verse 23 even calls the earliest coastal dwellers the Caphtorim. So the Bible and the archaeology are telling the same story from 2 directions, and I find that convergence quietly powerful. The written word of the prophets says Crete and the Aegean. The dirt says Crete and the Aegean. These were a sea people of Aegean stock, who washed up on the edge of Canaan when their own world fell apart, and then stayed and built. Because once you know to look, their fingerprints are everywhere in the ground. When archaeologists dig the early Philistine layers at sites like Ashkelon, they find pottery that does not belong to Canaanite tradition at all. The earliest is a locally made version of Mycenaean ware, what specialists call Philistine monochrome ware, and then a beautiful painted style known as Philistine bichrome. The shapes, the birds, the graceful spirals, all of it echoes the Aegean-style pottery of the Greek islands. Archaeology, done patiently, reads almost like a signature left in clay. The Leon Levy expedition that dug Ashkelon for decades found layer after layer of this material, and more. Hearths, loom weights, and pig bones that matched Aegean habits, not local ones. And the confirmation goes beyond broken pots. At Ekron, the site now called Tel Mikne, excavators uncovered something extraordinary in the 1990s. A royal dedicatory inscription carved in stone, naming the city of Ekron directly and listing several of its rulers by name. Think about what that means. For a long time, skeptics could wave a hand and say we were only guessing which mound was which ancient city. Then a stone came out of the ground with the city's own name written on it, and the guessing stopped. The 5 cities of the Bible are not literary inventions. They are real places you can stand in, real ruins you can measure, dug up one careful season at a time.
I find something quietly moving in all of this, and I want to name it before we moved on. For centuries, these cities were just word on the page to most readers, exotic name in an old story. Then the spade went in, and the word turned into wall, and pots, and burned layers, and an inscription with a king's name on it.
The more the ground gave up, the more the ancient text was confirmed as describing a real people in a real place, not a myth. That to me is part of why an oracle about this coast still commands attention. The stage it names is solid ground. Now, I want to slow all the way down and say something plainly, because it matters more than any pottery shard or temple relief. The Philistines of the Bible were an ancient people group, a specific nation with a specific origin in a specific century, who dissolved into history more than 2,000 years ago. They are not modern civilians, and nothing in this text licenses treating any living person as their stand-in. This is where careful reading protects us. When the prophets speak judgment over this coast, the judgment lands at the level of the text and the ancient nation it names, a text-level judgment on a vanished people, not a verdict on anyone breathing today. Hold on to that distinction with both hands. It is the guardrail that keeps this entire study honest. And we are about to walk straight into the 5 cities themselves. The Philistines did not organize themselves the way Israel did, and that single difference explains a great deal about their story. They had no capital city and no single king ruling from one throne. Instead, they built a confederation of 5 cities, each with its own ruler, bound together for war and for worship. Scholars call it the Pentapolis, from the Greek words for 5 cities. The Bible names them together in Joshua 13 verse 3, listing 5 lords of the Philistines, the Gazathites and the Ashtathites, the Eshkalonites, the Gittites and the Ekronites, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. 5 towns, 5 rulers, 1 people, strung along the southern coast like beads on a string. That word, lords, hides something fascinating in the Hebrew, and it is the kind of detail I love because it opens a window onto their origins. The text does not use the ordinary Hebrew word for king, melech. It uses a rare term, seranim, the plural of Saran, and the Hebrew Bible reserves that word almost exclusively for these Philistine rulers. Many linguists suspect it is not a Semitic word at all, but a loanword the Philistines carried with them from the Aegean, possibly related to the Greek word tyrannos, the root behind our English word tyrant. Sit with that for a moment. Even the title of their rulers still carried the accent of the sea they came from. Understand what this arrangement meant on the ground, because it shaped centuries of history. 5 fortified cities, close enough to reinforce one another quickly, could field a combined army that no single Israelite tribe could hope to match. When the Seranim agreed among themselves, they moved as one body. That is why, again and again through the books of Judges and Samuel, you watch the Philistines act with a coordination and a technological edge, especially in iron, that Israel could rarely equal in those early centuries. Here is where I have come to land, after sitting with these narratives for a long time. The Pentapolis was not just 5 dots on a map. It was a standing machine of pressure against the young nation to its east. 2 of those 5 cities sat right on the water, and they controlled something worth more than gold. Gaza and Ashkelon straddled the great coastal highway that the later Romans would name the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, the road that carried caravans and armies between Egypt and the empires of the north. Whoever held those 2 cities held the trade routes, and whoever held the trade routes grew rich. Gaza, the southernmost, was the last major stop before the deserts that led down into Egypt, the natural gateway for the incense and spice caravans coming up from Arabia. It was a customs house and a caravan city as much as a fortress. Ashkelon, for its part, was a true seaport, a harbor town open to the whole Mediterranean, with its own fleet and its own merchants trading across the water. Archaeologists have uncovered its massive fortifications, some of the oldest arched city gates in the world, the kind of walls a city builds when it has wealth to protect. It was exactly the sort of glittering prize a later empire would burn to the ground to make an example of the whole coast. When you picture these 2 cities, do not picture backwaters. Picture busy, wealthy, worldly ports, the New York and the New Orleans of their day. I think we sometimes read these city names as mere background scenery, a list of hard-to-pronounce places to skim past on the way to the action. But the people who first heard Zephaniah did not hear them that way at all. To them, Gaza and Ashkelon meant wealth, worldliness, and worldly power. The shining cities where the caravans unloaded and the ships came in. So when the prophet said Gaza would be forsaken and Ashkelon a desolation, his audience heard him aiming squarely at the richest, most connected towns on their entire horizon. It would be like naming the great financial capitals of your own century and calmly saying, "The grass will grow up" through their streets. The specificity is the whole point, and it is the specificity we have to keep in front of us as we turn to the last three cities. If Gaza and Ashkelon were the coast's front doors, Ashdod was its temple town. Ashdod was the home of Dagon, the chief god of the Philistines, and one of the most memorable and strange stories in all of Scripture unfolds inside that temple. In 1 Samuel 5, the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant in battle, the golden chest that represented the very presence of God among Israel. And they carry it in triumph into the house of Dagon in Ashdod. They set the ark down right beside their idol, like a trophy of war placed at the feet of the winning god. They meant it as a statement to heaven and earth. Their God had beaten Israel's God. But the morning told a different story than the one they expected. The people of Ashdod rise the next day and find Dagon fallen on his face before the ark, flat on the ground before the very trophy he was supposed to be lording over. They stand the idol back up. The following morning, Dagon is fallen again, and this time the head and both hands are broken off, lying on the threshold, only the stump of the idol left standing. Then, a plague breaks out. The text says, "The Lord struck the men of Ashdod with tumors, and the affliction spread, as the terrified Philistines shuttled the ark from city to city, until they finally begged to send it home." I have read that account many times, and what still strikes me is the sheer restraint of it. No Israelite army marches. No prophet stands there gloating. The ark simply sits in the enemy's own temple, and the enemy's own God cannot remain standing in its presence. Ekron, another of the 5 cities, is where the panicking Philistines finally send the ark on its way back, crying out that it will kill them all if it stays. Then there is Gath, and Gath has a reputation that everything else in the coast points toward. Gath was the giant city. When Joshua's generation cleared the hill country of the fearsome Anakim, the tall warrior clans whose size had terrified the 12 spies a generation earlier, the Bible pauses to note in Joshua 11 verse 22 that a remnant of them survived in only 3 places: in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Read that carefully. The giants did not simply vanish from the earth. They regrouped, and where they regrouped was the Philistine coast. The very clans Israel most feared found refuge in the 5 cities, and Gath, above all, became their stronghold. And centuries later, out of Gath, walks the most famous giant in the world. You know the name before I say it. Goliath of Gath, the champion who stood in the valley and defied the armies of the living God. A man the text measures at 6 cubits and a span, until a shepherd boy named David dropped him with a single stone. But Goliath was not alone in the record. The books of Samuel and Chronicles mention other giants of Gath as well, one with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, another whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. Gath bred them the way other cities bred merchants or sailors. Here is where I sit with the full weight of it. This coast was not a minor irritation on Israel's western flank. It produced the enemy's chief temple, the enemy's giants, the enemy's proudest and wealthiest cities. Its 5 lords could coordinate armies, its ports controlled the trade of nations, and its warriors were the stuff of Israel's nightmares. So when the prophets finally rise to speak judgment against this coast, understand that they are not picking a small or a safe target. They are addressing the oldest, hardest, most intimidating fault line in Israel's entire story, the one that ran the length of the Western Sea. And no one drew that fault line longer or more insistently than the prophets themselves. Amos drew it, Isaiah drew it, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Zechariah all drew it, each one turning to face the same shoreline across the centuries. That long prophetic tradition is the water Zephaniah was swimming in when he wrote his oracle, and it is exactly where we turn next. Because to feel the force of Zephaniah 2, you first have to hear the chorus of voices that had already been singing judgment over these 5 cities for generations before he ever picked up his pen. Before we reach Zephaniah's oracle itself, I want to walk the long road that leads up to it, because Zephaniah was not the first voice raised against that coast. Not by centuries. To feel the full weight of his 4 short lines, you have to hear the whole chorus that came before him, and that chorus begins in the Book of Judges. There, the Philistines are Israel's constant thorn, the recurring pressure from the west that God used again and again to discipline and to test his people. Whenever Israel drifted, the coast pressed in, and the single most unforgettable figure of that whole era rose up precisely to meet that pressure. His name was Samson, a man set apart from birth, a Nazirite, which meant he had taken a vow that kept him from wine and from cutting his hair, an outward sign of a life dedicated to God. His strength was legendary, and the story ties that strength directly to his vow. For 20 years he was a one-man war against the Philistine cities, tearing their gates from the walls, striking down their soldiers, humiliating their lords. But the coast learned patience. They studied him, and in the end, they found the way to him, and her name was Delilah. I have always felt the Book of Judges tells this story with its eyes wide open, refusing to flatter its own hero. Samson was not brought down by an army. He was brought down by his own appetites, coaxed night after night by a woman the lords of the Philistines paid handsomely to learn the secret of his strength. When she finally had it, they shaved his head, put out his eyes, and chained him to grind grain like an animal in a Gaza prison. It is one of the darkest falls in Scripture, and yet the story does not end in that prison. It ends in the temple of Dagon, where a blind and broken Samson, his hair grown back and his prayer answered, braces himself against the 2 central pillars and pulls the whole structure down on himself and thousands of his captors at once. Even Israel's most flawed champion took a Philistine temple down with him when he went. The next great collision is the one every child learns in Sunday school, and it deserves a far closer look than the children's version usually gives it. The armies of Israel and Philistia face each other across the valley of Elah, a real place you can still walk today, a broad ravine in the Judean foothills, with a dry stream bed running down its center. Out of the Philistine ranks steps Goliath of Gath, the giant we met a moment ago, and for 40 days he strides out and taunts the armies of Israel to send a single man to fight him. No one will. The king himself will not. Fear settles over the whole valley like a fog. Then, a shepherd arrives, carrying bread for his older brothers, and he hears the taunt, and something in him simply refuses to let it stand. What happens next in 1 Samuel 17 is not really a story about physical size at all. It is a story about who the coast's power could and could not intimidate. David refuses the king's heavy armor. He walks down into that dry stream bed in the middle of the valley, bends, and chooses 5 smooth stones from the brook, and faces the champion of Gath with a shepherd's sling and a sentence about the name of the Lord of hosts. 1 stone. The giant falls face first into the dust, and the whole Philistine battle line breaks and runs. I have come to think this is exactly why the memory of that valley never faded in Israel's imagination. It was the day the coast's proudest and most terrifying weapon, its giants, was answered by the least likely person on the entire field, a boy with no armor and no sword. The Pentapolis could field its Seranim, its coordinated armies, and its champions from Gath. What it could not do, in the end, was outhold the God who kept turning up on the losing side's behalf. And that same pattern, the coast's power meeting a limit it did not set for itself, only deepens in the scene we have to consider next. I mentioned the Ark a moment ago, but it deserves its own pause, because it is the clearest picture in the whole Bible of what these prophets believed about the Philistine coast. Go back to 1 Samuel 5. The Philistines have won a battle and captured the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that represented the very presence of God dwelling among Israel. And here's the telling thing. They do not destroy it. They honor it in the worst possible way, by placing it in the temple of Dagon at Ashdod, as a spoil of war. a captured God displayed beneath the victorious one. And then, without a single Israelite lifting so much as a finger, their own God comes apart in the dark. Dagon fell on his face before the ark. Once, his worshippers set him upright. Then again the next morning, and this time the idol lay headless and handless on the threshold of its own house, only the trunk remaining. What follows reads almost like a plague narrative out of Exodus. The men of the Philistine cities are struck with painful tumors, an affliction that moves with the ark from Ashdod to Gath to Ekron, spreading city to city, until the lords of the 5 cities gather in outright panic and decide they must send the thing away before it kills them all. They finally returned the ark to Israel on a new cart pulled by 2 milk cows, along with golden offerings shaped like the tumors and the mice that had ravaged them, a guilt payment to a god they could not fight.
I sit with that image often, and it never quite loses its strangeness. The most powerful confederations of Israel's entire border, undone not by a sword or siege, but by its simple fact that it had taken hold of something it could not hold. That, I believe, is the seed of every latter oracle spoken against this coast.
The prophets carried a memory. They remembered a God who did not need Israel's army to answer the Philistine cities, a God who could humble the whole Pentapolis from inside its own temple, in the quiet of the night, and then walk himself home on a farm cart. Once you have that memory in your bones, the judgment oracles stop sounding like boasts and start sounding like sober expectation. So when we finally reach the writing prophets, we are not hearing some brand new idea dropped out of the sky. We are hearing a chorus that had been building for generations. Amos, in the 8th century, thunders against the coast in Amos 1 verse 6 through 8, promising fire on the walls of Gaza and the cutting off of the inhabitants from Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron. Isaiah warns Philistia not to rejoice too soon at a moment of relief, because a worse blow is coming from the north. Jeremiah devotes an entire chapter, Jeremiah 47, to the day the waters rise out of the north like a flood, to overwhelm the Philistine plain and leave Gaza bald with grief. And the chorus keeps going. Ezekiel 25 verse 16 declares that God will stretch out his hand against the Philistines and cut off the Cherethites, that old sea people name surfacing yet again to mark their origin. And Zechariah 9 verse 5 generations later still picks up the very same city roll call, naming Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod in one sweeping line of judgment. The same cities in nearly the same order. Prophet after prophet, spread across 3 or 4 centuries, keeps turning to face the identical shoreline and keeps naming the identical handful of towns. Do you see what is actually happening here? This is the context most readers never get before they open Zephaniah 2. They stumble onto his oracle and treat it as a strange, isolated one-off, an odd little judgment against some obscure coast. It is nothing of the sort. It is one voice in a long, patient, deliberate line, each prophet adding his own witness that the God of Israel had said a word against the Philistine coast. Zephaniah's real contribution is not that he spoke against Gaza. Plenty had done that. His contribution is the sheer precision of it, the buried wordplay, and the astonishing promise folded into the very end. And that, at last, is what we are ready to read, slowly, line by line. Here is the passage itself, and I want to read it aloud before I say a single word about it. Zephaniah 2 verse 4. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. One verse. 4 cities, 4 separate fates. Read it again, and notice what the prophet does not do. He does not simply say the coast will fall, in general, as a lump. He hands each city its own sentence, its own verb, its own particular manner of ending. This is a jeweler's work, not a hammer's. Look at how deliberate each clause is. Gaza will be forsaken, abandoned, emptied out of its people, until it stands hollow. Ashkelon will become a desolation, a silence, the busy harbor town reduced to a ruin where nothing stirs. Ashdod, the temple city, will be driven out at the noonday, and that little phrase carries a real sting once you understand ancient warfare. Armies rested at midday, in the worst of the heat. That was the safe hour, the sleepy hour. To be driven out at noon meant to be overwhelmed so suddenly and so completely that the enemy did not even bother to wait for the cool of evening to finish the job. And Ekron will be rooted up, torn out of the ground like a plant pulled up by the roots, the most total and final image of the four. I have read a great many judgment oracles across the prophets, and I still find this single verse remarkable for its restraint and its precision. It does not rant. It does not pile up adjectives or threats. It simply names each city, assigns it a fate, and moves down the line like a surveyor marking plots. And there is one absence in the verse that speaks as loudly as any of the names present. Zephaniah lists 4 of the 5 cities of the Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron. He does not name Gath. Many scholars have noticed that missing name, and I think the best explanation is also the simplest and most striking. By Zephaniah's day, in the late 7th century BC, Gath had already fallen. The great giant city had been devastated more than a century earlier, likely by Hazael of Aram, and it had never recovered its old place among the powers of the coast. So the prophet names the 4 cities that were still standing, still proud, still worth a warning, and quietly passes over the one already lying in the dust. Think about what that means. Even the silence in the verse is accurate to its historical moment. He counted the living cities, left out the dead one, and history has confirmed his arithmetic. Now, if you could hear this verse in its original Hebrew, you would catch something the English simply cannot carry across, and it is one of my favorite features in the entire oracle. The verse is built on sound play, what scholars call Hebrew paronomasia, a kind of prophetic punning in which the fate of a city rhymes with the very sound of its name. It is poetry welded to prophecy. Watch how it works. Gaza, in Hebrew Aza, is paired with the word Azuva, forsaken. Aza, Azuva. The name and the doom chime together like 2 struck bells. And Ekron, in Hebrew Ekron, is paired with Tiaker, rooted up. Ekron, Tiaker. The city's name and its uprooting share the same consonantal root, so that the sentence sounds like the name turning inside out. The prophet is not merely predicting an outcome. He is composing, folding each city's ruin into the syllables of its own name, so that once you have heard the line, you can no longer say the city's name without hearing its sentence riding along inside it. That, I have come to believe, is the work of a poet who knew exactly what he was doing, and who wanted the judgment to be unforgettable. The oracle does not stop with the 4 cities. Verse 5 widens the lens and turns the address to the whole region at once. Woe unto the inhabitants of the seacoast, the nation of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, the land of the Philistines. I will even destroy thee, that there shall be no inhabitant. Slow down on the names packed into that one verse, because every one of them is doing careful work. The prophet calls the people the nation of the Cherethites, an old term that many scholars connect to Crete and the Aegean, the sea origin we traced earlier in this study. In a single word, he is reminding his hearers that these were a people who first came from across the water, and then he names the land itself, Canaan, the land of the Philistines. That phrase is worth holding in your hand for a moment, because it is the ancient name that would echo down the centuries far beyond the prophet's lifetime. The word that the Greeks and later the Romans would eventually attach to the whole region grew out of this very root, the name of the Philistine coast. But in Zephaniah's mouth it means one specific and limited thing, the territory of that ancient 5-city people, now placed under a divine sentence. I will even destroy thee, that there shall be no inhabitant. No inhabitant. That is the language of a place completely emptied out, swept clean of the nation that built it. And I want to keep saying, as plainly and as often as I can, that this is a word set against an ancient nation and its cities in the 7th century BC. It is not a script for anyone to lift out of context and aim at living people on that land today. The prophet's own frame is the ancient Philistine coast and the vanished people who dwelt there, and simple honesty keeps us standing exactly where he stood. The moment we let the verse slide off the ancient page and onto a modern map of real human beings, we have stopped reading Zephaniah and started using him. And those are very different things. Then comes the turn, and it is one of the most beautiful reversals in all the prophetic books. Verses 6 and 7. And the sea coast shall be dwellings and cottages for shepherds, and folds for flocks, and the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. Picture the shift the prophet is painting. The busy harbor cities, the loaded caravans, the temples of Dagon, the Seranim on their thrones, all of it gone quiet, and in its place, grass, sheep on the dunes, the low stone folds for flocks that dot any pastoral country, cottages for shepherds standing where crowded merchant houses once rose. The proudest commercial coast in the whole region, reduced to grazing land. And to whom does that emptied coast finally belong? The remnant of the house of Judah. The verse continues with a tenderness that catches you off guard after all the ruin. They shall feed their flocks there, and in the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening. For the Lord their God shall visit them, and turn away their captivity. Read that slowly with me. The same coast, sentenced to desolation back in verse 4, is, only 3 verses later, promised to God's own people at the turning of captivity. The very moment God would gather his scattered exiles home. Ruin and restoration held together in a single breath, by the same hand. Between you and me, this is the line that made me want to make this whole video in the first place, because it quietly tells you that the oracle was never only about ending something. It was about who would still be standing, grazing their flocks, and lying down at evening by the sea, long after the empires that came for that coast had themselves passed into the dust. The judgment and the mercy are not 2 separate messages awkwardly stitched together. They are one message about a God who holds the whole shoreline, the fall and the future both, which raises the one question every honest reader has to ask at this point. Did any of this actually happen? Did the cities really fall, and did the remnant really return? That is exactly where we go next. And the answer is written not only in the Bible, but in the enemy's own records. Did the oracle come true? Follow the coast road north out of Egypt, the way an invading army would actually come, and watch carefully what history did to these cities. Within a single generation of Zephaniah's ministry, the first hammer fell, and it fell exactly where he had pointed. The instrument was Babylon, and the man swinging it was Nebuchadnezzar. After the Babylonians crushed Egypt's army at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, the entire coastal plain lay open before them, undefended, and Nebuchadnezzar came straight down it, city by city. The year to remember is 604 BC, and we are not leaning on the Bible alone for this one. That is what makes it so striking. The Babylonian Chronicle, a cuneiform record kept by Babylon's own royal scribes, states plainly that in that year, Nebuchadnezzar marched against the city of Ashkelon, captured it, seized its king, and turned the city into a ruin, a heap, and a mound of rubble. Ashkelon destroyed. The seaport that Zephaniah said would become a desolation was reduced to smoking wreckage by the Babylonian conquest, and Babylon itself wrote the report. Think about what it means to be able to lay a Hebrew prophet's oracle down beside the enemy empire's own war diary, and watch the same city fall in both texts, roughly a generation apart. I do not reach for the word proof lightly, so I will simply say that the alignment here is about as tight as ancient history ever gets. A prophet in Judah wrote that Ashkelon would be a desolation. A Babylonian scribe in Nebuchadnezzar's court wrote that Nebuchadnezzar made Ashkelon a mound. 2 hostile sources, 1 event. That is the kind of thing that makes a careful reader sit very still for a while, and the archaeology has met the chronicle down in the dirt, which is what finally made it real for me. The excavations at Ashkelon uncovered a thick destruction layer dated to exactly this period. A burned horizon of collapsed buildings, smashed storage jars, charred beams, and the debris of a city that ended violently, all dated to the very end of the 7th century BC. The digging matched the tablet, and the tablet matched the prophet. In one shop, archaeologists found the wine jars still lined up where the merchant had left them, sealed forever under the ash of 604. That is what the end of Ashkelon actually looks like, when you can hold a piece of it in your hand. Here is the detail that stays with me longest, though, because it puts human faces on the word forsaken. What became of the people of that coast? When a Babylonian army took a city, they were carried off. The Babylonians practiced mass deportation as deliberate policy, marching the leaders, the skilled craftsmen, and the royal households of a conquered place back to the imperial heartland in order to break the will of the region for good. And we have the receipts, quite literally, written on clay. Among the Babylonian ration tablets unearthed at Babylon, administrative records listing the oil and grain doled out to captives living in the city. There are entries for the sons of Aga, the king of Ashkelon, and for Ashkelonite mariners and craftsmen, now living as exiles in the very shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Read that slowly and let it land. The king of Ashkelon's own household, named on a Babylonian pantry list, hundreds of miles from the sea that had made his city rich. The oracle said the coast would be forsaken. The deportation tablets let us watch the forsaking happen, one exiled name at a time, in the enemy's own careful bookkeeping. But Babylon was only the first wave to break over that coast. When Babylon itself fell to Persia in 539 BC, the shoreline passed quietly under Persian administration, and its old 5-city independence was gone for good. The cities lingered on in a reduced form, now merely tax districts on the edge of a vast Persian empire, their walls lower and their Saranum only a memory. The Pentapolis as a sovereign power, a confederation that could field its own armies and dictate to its neighbors, had simply ended. And then came the wave that finished the whole story, and its name was Alexander. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great swept down that same coastal road on his relentless march toward Egypt, and one city on the shore refused to open its gates to him: Gaza. Gaza sat high on a great mound, heavily walled and well-provisioned, and its commander, a man the sources call Batis, decided to hold out against the conqueror who had already broken every power in his path. What followed was one of the hardest fights of Alexander's entire campaign, a grueling 2-month siege of Gaza that cost him a serious shoulder wound and an enormous expenditure of effort and men. He built a great siege ramp of earth around the city, hauled up the very engines that had already shattered the island fortress of Tyre, and when the walls finally gave way, the ancient sources describe a brutal sack, the defenders killed, and the surviving population sold into slavery. The city that had guarded the road to Egypt for 1,000 years, the southern gateway of the whole coast, was broken open and emptied in a matter of days. I find it genuinely sobering that the last great stand of the old Philistine coast ended under a Greek king in 332 BC, with the people carried off exactly as the earlier cities had been carried off by Babylon 3 centuries before. The pattern held all the way down. After Alexander, the entire region was thoroughly reshaped by the Hellenistic era that followed. The cities that survived at all were rebuilt as Greek towns, with Greek names, Greek institutions, and Greek gods layered over the old Semitic and Aegean foundations. Ashdod became Azotus. Ashkelon reinvented itself as a thriving Hellenistic port, and later, a proud Roman city. And somewhere in those quiet centuries of rebuilding and renaming, the thing Zephaniah's oracle was ultimately pointing toward actually came to pass. The Philistines vanish. Not the city sites, mind you. Some of them were inhabited for many centuries more, and a few are inhabited to this day. What vanishes is the people, as a distinct nation, with their own language, their own gods, their own Saranим, and their own living memory of the Aegean Sea they had come from. The Philistines simply ceased to appear in the historical record. By the time of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC, no writer speaks of Philistines as a living people anymore. There is no distinct people group left to speak of. Their identity had dissolved into the larger Hellenistic world that washed over them, and their name survived only as a label attached to the land. That is the piece I keep returning to, again and again. Empires are loud when they die. They fall in sieges and fires and chronicles, with dates you can circle. But a people group disappearing is a quiet thing. There is no single battle where the Philistines end. No last stand you can point to and say, there. That is the moment they were no more. There is only a slow fade, until one day the name means a stretch of geography and nothing else, emptied of the nation that once carried it. Zephaniah had written, "There shall be no inhabitant." And centuries later, the specific ancient people he addressed were simply gone from history, their name outliving them as a mere place on a map.
I have sat with that for a long time, and I still do not have a tidy sentence to wrap it up. A watchman on a hill in Judah named 4 cities and a people, and the long reign of Babylon, Persia, and Greeks emptied all 5 cities and dissolved the nation. Whatever you finally make up a prophecy, that is a strange and sober thing to watch unfold across the centuries.
But we have only followed half of the oracle so far. The ruin came. Yes, wave after wave of it. Now we have to ask about the promise, because Zephaniah did not end his word on rubble. He ended it on shepherds. Verse 7 says, "The coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening. For the Lord their God shall visit them, and turn away their captivity." The remnant of the house of Judah. That phrase is the hinge of the whole passage. Hold on to why that matters. The oracle was never merely a threat hurled at an enemy coast. From the very beginning it was tied to something hopeful, to the return of their captivity, to the day God would remember and gather his own scattered people home from exile. The judgment on the cities and the mercy toward the remnant are bound together in the same sentence, spoken in the same breath. A prophet who only wanted to curse the Philistines would have stopped at verse 5. Zephaniah kept writing, and what he wrote next was homecoming. And that homecoming has its own history, both in the ground and on the page. When Babylon fell and Persia rose, King Cyrus issued the famous decree that permitted the exiles of Judah to go home. This is the return from Babylon, and it did not happen all at once, but in slow waves across generations. They came back and rebuilt the temple under Zerubbabel, laying a foundation while old men wept remembering the first temple. Later, they rebuilt the shattered walls of Jerusalem under Nehemiah, working with a trowel in one hand and a weapon in the other, replanting a people in a land that the very same Babylonian machine had emptied. The Judean reoccupation of the wider land was gradual, partial, and often bitter, but it was undeniably real. And over the long centuries that followed the return, the coastal plain that had once belonged to the 5 Philistine cities slowly came within the reach of that resettled people. By the days of the later Judean kingdoms, in the Hasmonean era, towns and territory along that very shoreline were held and worked by the descendants of Judah. The prophet had said, the coast would be for the remnant. History took its slow time about it, several centuries of it. But the remnant did in fact spread down toward the sea, and flocks did in fact graze where the harbor cities had stood. I want to be careful and honest here too, because this is where readers can overreach. The fulfillment of verse 7 was not a single dramatic morning when Judah marched onto the coast and the trumpets sounded. It was slow, uneven, and easy to miss if you were only looking for a headline. That is actually how a great deal of biblical prophecy works, and it is worth learning the rhythm of it. The word is planted. Empires come and go. And only when you stand far enough back, after centuries, do you see the shape the prophet described quietly emerging from the long grind of history. Patience is built into the very structure of the thing. Now, I want to say clearly what I believe this oracle is really about at its core, because it is very easy to get lost counting cities and miss the actual thesis. Zephaniah 2 is not fundamentally a story about the Philistines losing a contest. It is a story about God being sovereign over nations, all of them, the great and the small alike, the coast and the empire that comes marching down to crush the coast. Read the whole chapter again with that lens, and you cannot miss it. Philistia to the west, Moab and Ammon to the east, Cush to the south, Assyria and its proud capital to the north. Every point of the compass answers to the same throne. That is the frame that has to govern everything else. The judgment in this text lands at the level of nations and their pride before God, at the level of the text and the ancient world it describes. It is not a verdict on a race or a people group in any modern sense, and it is most certainly not a permission slip for anyone alive to act against their neighbors. I cannot stress that strongly enough. The entire point of the chapter is that God, and not any human army, holds the fate of the coastlines in his hand. Read it as a mandate for human violence, and you have inverted the very thing it was written to say. So why does an oracle, this ancient, still unsettle, careful readers, why does it keep getting dragged back into the headlines, generation after generation? I think it is because ancient prophecy, when it is this specific, this willing to name the towns in order, is genuinely disquieting to encounter. It names concrete things, and then the long centuries seem to answer back, city by city. That is unnerving in a way vague predictions never are. But here is where the discipline matters most, and where I want to be a watchman and not a predictor. My whole job with a text like this is to watch closely and to read faithfully, not to set dates or to claim I can map an ancient oracle neatly onto next week's newsfeed. I do not do date setting, and I would gently and seriously warn you away from anyone who does, no matter how confident they sound. What Zephaniah hands us is not a countdown clock ticking toward a headline. It is a window into how the Hebrew prophets actually saw their God, patient, exact, sovereign over every nation on earth, and able to hold judgment and mercy together in a single line. That posture, that watchman's steadiness, is the thing worth carrying out of this chapter, far more than any attempt to force ancient prophecy onto a modern map. And in the end, that is what I want to leave in your hands. So let me gather up what we have actually seen, because the whole shape only appears when you stand back from it. A prophet on a small hill in Judah named 4 cities on a coast he could not see from where he stood, and folded each city's ruin into the very sound of its own name. Then Babylon came, and Ashkelon burned in 604 BC, its king carried off in chains. Then Persia came, and the old 5-city independence quietly ended. Then Greece came, and Gaza fell after a bitter 2-month siege, and slowly, in the centuries that followed, the Philistines themselves dissolved out of history, until only their names survived on a map. Look at the pattern that leaves us with. Empires rose and fell along that shoreline, one after another, Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome after them, each one loud and utterly certain of its own permanence. And through all of it, across the coastline's long arc of centuries, the small text stayed. The nations that came to conquer the coast are themselves long gone, their kings dust, their tablets sitting in museum drawers, and the words stood. That, far more than any single city's fall, is what this chapter finally sets in front of us. Not a boast about ruin, but a quiet demonstration of what outlasts what.
I want to be honest with you about what I have and have not shown you, because that honesty is itself part of reading well. Scholars have wasted these texts for centuries, and they disagree on a great deal, on precise date, on how tightly to draw each connection, on what should and should not count as fulfillment.
I am not pretending those debates do not exist. What I have offered you today is one careful reading, one that tries to stay close to the words on the page and the records recovered from the ground, and no further. So please do not take me as the final word on Zephaniah, because I am not, and I would not want to be. If anything in this study has stirred something in you, then do the thing that truly honors a text like this. Study the primary sources for yourself. Read the whole chapter in your own Bible, slowly, with the surrounding oracles around it. Look up the Babylonian Chronicle and the ration tablets. Sit with the passage the way I have sat with it, for as long as it takes, and see where you honestly land. I believe you will find it deeper and stranger, and more careful than any single video could ever hold. If you have stayed with me all the way to this point, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel is really for. Someone who would rather dig into a text than be handed a slogan about it. So here is my one ask, and it is a small and simple one. If you are watching this as a fellow student of the text, comment and tell me the city or the country you are reading from tonight, because I genuinely like knowing who else is out here walking these old roads carefully. And 2 more quiet invitations, no pressure attached. If this study was worth your time, subscribe, since there is always another passage waiting to be walked through slowly next time. And if you know someone who loves scripture and history the way you clearly do, share this with a fellow student of the text. That, in the end, is simply how the careful readers manage to find one another in a noisy world. No hype, no urgency. Just one thoughtful person handing a good thing to the next. And before we close, let me pray, because that is how we always end here. Father, we thank you for a word that has outlasted empires, for the patience and the precision of the prophets you sent to a small and frightened kingdom. We confess that you alone hold the nations, every one of them, and that your sovereignty of God over all nations is finally a mercy and not a terror. Because you judge in righteousness, and you remember the remnant, even in the ruin. We remember tonight that all people are his, every coast and every city, every tongue and every tribe, each one made in your image and precious in your sight, none of them a target for our contempt. Give us humility to read your word carefully, courage to tell the truth about what it says and what it does not say, and deep grace toward everyone who bears your image, including those we are tempted to forget. Keep us as watchmen, steady and clear-eyed, and never as people who traffic in fear. We ask all of it in your name. Amen. Walk carefully, read closely, and keep watching.